The werewolf on the dirt road attacked my bus. Hello, the events I'm going to recount here took place in the early 2000s, between 2004 and 2005. It took me a lot of effort to gather the courage to tell this story. To this day, I'm afraid of traveling on certain roads, especially those surrounded by dense forests. I shudder every time the images of that grotesque creature come back to my mind. I'll tell you now, detailing as much as I remember of what happened. At the time, I was about 35 years old. I had spent years in the capital, trying to make a living. Unfortunately, I never managed to settle into a single job. I don't know why, but I couldn't feel comfortable there. It wasn't my home, after all. You know when you no longer feel like you belong somewhere? People don't understand you, the city doesn't understand you, nothing fits where it should. That's what I felt at the time. Those of us who live in the countryside always have this idea of going to the big city to make a living. But no one ever tells us how much we have to sacrifice for it. All I know is that I decided to go back home, my true home, to my hometown in the countryside. I won't mention the city's name for the sake of description. Understand, it was indeed a small town, with a population of no more than 20,000 at the time, with a significant portion living in rural areas. I decided to return by bus. It was about a day and a half of travel, but it was worth it considering the cost of a plane ticket to the nearest airport to my hometown, which wasn't really close. I took one of those interstate buses from a small company, and I vividly remember how old it was. I swear, I don't know how that bus managed to endure so much time on the road. The journey was peaceful. We left in the early morning, and the bus only had a few empty seats. During the trip, when I wasn't sleeping, I was chatting with other passengers. From what I could gather, most of them would get off before me. Occasionally, during meal times, the bus stopped at these convenience stores accustomed to serving travelers, and at bus stations, so everyone could grab snacks or buy them on site upon disembarking. Between my naps, I noticed people getting off the bus as the journey progressed, and it gradually emptied. The landscape changed. Now, you could see some mountains, open and dense forests, and various cattle farms in small and large estates. I won't lie, I was very excited to return to my land, to see my old friends, my family, and my grandmother's old house. All the good memories played in my mind during the trip. It was already night, around 8 p.m., when the bus made a stop at a restaurant in a certain town for dinner and necessities. At that point, we were close to my hometown. Probably by early morning, I would be home. Many passengers disembarked in that town. The bus was almost empty, only about 6 people remained, besides me and the driver. Some would get off in my town, and others would continue to the final destination. We boarded again after completing everything, and the driver continued the journey. The road at this point was no longer a federal highway but a state one. The asphalt wasn't the best, some parts were quite winding and potholed, causing the bus to sway a lot. Hours passed, and it was almost 11 p.m. The puseo, as we call it around here, swayed so much that it was challenging to sleep. I pulled out a book, lit the pocket flashlight I carried, and decided to read until I got sleepy again. If I slept, I wouldn't feel the delay in reaching my destination. I sat at the back, where there was only an elderly man nearby. All I could see were his white hair and the gleam of his huge gold watch in the darkness. The rest of the passengers were sitting in the middle and further to the front of the bus. Taking advantage of having no one next to me, I stretched my legs over the adjacent seat. I read and got engrossed in the story. I remember the book I was reading was cked de Eerie by Jorge Amado. I loved the character Professor, and it's still one of my favorite books. I was so focused on the book that when I looked to the side, out of the window, I noticed something different. The open forest that was there before was now dense and closed. It had been a long time since I had passed through there, but I was sure that at that point in the journey, the forest shouldn't be so closed. Then I noticed something else. The sound of the road the bus was making had changed. It wasn't asphalt anymore, but the noise of dirt road. I found it strange again because even if the road was terrible, at that point, it should still be asphalt, not a dirt road. I looked at the ground between the bus's side and the forest and realized I was right, it was indeed a dirt road. I became curious, looked out the window on the other side, and noticed that it was also a densely closed forest. The road was getting narrower, barely enough for two small cars to pass in opposite directions. It was clearly a rural road, not a highway. I thought, and I concluded that it was probably some kind of shortcut that I wasn't aware of. But I was very surprised that the driver chose to go through such a place at that time, even if it meant shortening the route. The clock already showed that it was midnight, around 2 a.m. It was all very poorly lit. You could barely see anything from inside the bus, and the full moon was half covered by the cloudy sky. So, I decided to go to the driver and ask what he was doing and where on earth we were. I got up and walked slowly to the front. I noticed on the way that everyone was sleeping, or at least seemed to be. The bus was moving slowly due to the potholes on the dirt road. With much effort, I reached the driver's cabin. He was a bit startled by my sudden presence, but thankfully, it didn't distract him from driving. I asked, "Where are we? Is this some kind of shortcut?" He looked at me quickly and said that it was exactly that, a shortcut, and that this way we would reach my town even before dawn. He seemed a bit agitated, and his tone of voice was a bit too loud. I overlooked it and tried to relax. I headed back to the back of the bus. When I was halfway there, a massive jolt occurred, and one of the rear tires seemed to have suffered a huge impact. With a lot of willpower, I managed to prevent myself from falling face first on the floor, holding onto the seats. The driver stopped the bus immediately. He grabbed a flashlight and quickly got off. Everyone on the bus woke up with the commotion. There was a murmur, everyone wanted to know what the hell had happened. The driver had the flashlight pointed down at the right rear wheel, as if searching for something. I asked what had happened, and he promptly replied, "I think the tire punctured in that big pothole back there. I didn't see it in this darkness, and I drove right over it." At that moment, I didn't quite understand how he hadn't seen it if the rear wheel had been hit, not the front one. I mean, if he avoided the front of the hole, then he should have also avoided the rear. I didn't want to question him to avoid making things worse for him, but I didn't like it at all. The other passengers, on the other hand, didn't think much about trying to help the driver. They confronted him right away, asking why on earth they were in the middle of nowhere, why he took a shortcut without informing anyone, as someone might have wanted to get off before the city, for example. They blamed him for everything that was happening, calling it his fault and his stupidity. Unlike the heated argument between the passengers and the driver, the night was very cold, and a strong wind cut through the side of the bus, along with fine raindrops starting to fall from the heavy clouds. And that's when everything started to turn into the nightmare that haunts me every night to this day. A howl, very loud and deep, came from behind the dense forest. It wasn't a dog or wolf howl, as seen in movies. Instead, it was more like a jaguar's roar but much deeper. The discussion stopped instantly, and everyone looked around in silence. One of the ladies said, "What the hell was that, my God?" And a young guy, perhaps her son, replied, "It sounded like an animal." Without hesitation, I suggested that everyone get inside. If it was something like a puma, for example, it would be dangerous to linger there. When I turned towards the bus entrance, I noticed that the driver was already there, getting ready to enter. He looked back, and the second howl came, now louder, as if it were even closer to us. Panic set in, the driver had already entered, and now the other passengers, like me, ran towards the door amid screams and pushing. The old lady who earlier questioned what that howl was stumbled and fell. Her son and another young guy went back to try to lift her. I hesitated to go back and help too. When I looked back, I saw what I would never believe existed if I hadn't seen it myself. A huge monster jumped onto one of the guys, who wasn't the lady's son. It was furry, with a dark brown, wet-looking fur. It had a dog-like face, gray, with huge red eyes, as well as its mouth, with massive canines. But it wore a white dress shirt, open to show its chest, completely soaked. It shook its head like a mad dog, growling and drooling. It grabbed the guy and dug its claws into his arms, trying to bite his neck. I was terrified, and the young son of the lady stared paralyzed at the creature. One thing was certain, it was going to devour that man and kill him right there. That's when I noticed, on the arm of that creature, or rather, that werewolf, was the same watch I had seen on the wrist of the old man who was next to me. It clicked for me, since the bus had stopped, I hadn't seen the old man, he was the only one who hadn't gotten off. Or rather, I didn't see him get off. In the hope of helping, I started waving my arms forward and shouting loudly. I know it was crazy, but I couldn't just turn my back on that situation, despite it being so frightening. The werewolf felt bothered, it stopped trying to bite the guy and turned towards me, squinting its eyes and growling. There, I knew it would be my end. It stood up and stood on two legs, or rather, feet, which were arched backward, like animal paws. When it returned to four legs, ready to jump on me, the guy who was lying under that creature pulled out a huge knife from his waist and stabbed it into the creature's leg area. The werewolf groaned, letting out a very loud howl of pain. It fell and limped, looking at us. That being exuded pure rage, along with a very unpleasant smell of sulfur. Suddenly, from inside the bus, everyone who managed to climb up started shouting, trying to drive that being away. They were inside, watching the whole action all this time. The old lady was still static, but I and the other two guys joined in the shouting. The creature felt cornered or something, it looked at the knife in the almost grazed hand and jumped into the bushes. We could hear the howls or screams of the werewolf coming from the forest. I don't know if it was out of pain or anger for not having feasted on us. We helped the old lady and ran inside the bus. Inside, the driver was restless, questioning us about what we had done. What did you do? What did you do to him? He opened the bus door again, threatening us, saying that if we had harmed his father, we would pay for it. And he left, entering the dense forest, shouting for his father. All of us were very scared, trying to process what had happened. We waited for the day to dawn since no one was crazy enough to go out in that darkness with that creature on the loose, not to mention its son, of course. When it dawned, we were relieved that neither the driver or the old man returned to the bus. We walked along the road until we found a signal on our cell phones, those brick-like ones at the time, and called for help. When we reached my town, we tried to explain what had happened, but, of course, they didn't believe everything. However, they issued a search and seizure warrant for the driver, for a possible kidnapping, but they never found either of them. To this day, I think about that incident and imagine how many monsters of that kind are out there and how many victims those two made in the same way. The only things that remain for me are to be suspicious of any situation and never underestimate the supernatural. Thank you for accompanying me to the end of this story.